While Group B is incredibly well known, almost legendary in fact among anyone with even the slightest interest in rallying, very few people truly know the details of the cars. The reason for this is partly as it's well over 30 years since mainstream Group B rallying ended, but it's also the fact that these cars were very secretive and constantly changing in spec. So what was Group B? Well, without getting into the very fine details, Group B was a class intended for modified sports cars. The rules are surprisingly strict with regard to what is allowed to be changed between the production road cars and rally cars. And while most know this to be the case with Group A rallying, it was also the case with Group B. For example, the inlet and exhaust manifolds, intercoolers, turbocharger size, in fact most of the engine internals had to be the same parts on the road gun versions as the rally cars. Rallying isn't a free-for-all of changing parts for upgraded ones like many think. For Group B, however, the powers that be envisioned it to be for modified sports cars, which were generally made in far lower numbers and probably don't have 4 seats either. They meant things like Porsches, Ferraris and so on. Therefore, the only real stipulation was that at least 200 road cars needed to be produced to allow the car to be homologated into the series. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for us really, the manufacturers interpreted the rules differently and decided, rather than using already produced production sports cars, 200 cars were a low enough production run that they could just justify building a custom-made rally monster designed specifically for Group B rallying, and the fact the road versions were thinly disguised rally cars, often poorly made, unreliable, terrible to drive, and sold at a huge loss to the general public, or in some cases arguably didn't even exist at all, was no problem for them when it was only 200 cars they had to build. To add to the craziness of Group B rallying, each year even wilder evolution versions of the Group B cars were allowed to be homologated just by building 20 more cars. While that alone doesn't seem to be a problem for most manufacturers, the majority of these 20 cars needed for the evolution homologations didn't even seem to exist. Faking production numbers, changing car ID plates to masquerade as multiple cars, or simply the powers that be turning a blind eye to it and allowing the evolutions to be used despite the required number of cars simply not existing. Now you know the basics of the Group B rally rules, let's have a detailed technical look at what made these cars the wild animals they were, and looking into the info almost never talked or even known about by most people. For this video, the first in the series which will cover all the top Group B rally cars, I'm going to start with probably the best known one of them all, the Audi Sport Quattro S1.
Fastest automobiles.
The most obvious visual difference with the Sport Quattro is the car is shorter and wider. So over 24 cm, which is about 10 inches shorter, and over 7 cm, which is about 3 inches wider. The Sport Quattro is commonly known as the short wheelbase Quattro, and surprise surprise, it's because the wheelbase is much shorter too. It's 32 cm, which is about 12.5 inches shorter than the original UR Quattro. The engine capacity in Group B dictated both minimum weight and maximum tyre size, and the homologated capacity of this car is between 2134cc and 2142cc, which after the 1.4 multiplier for having forced induction, that sits the car right at the top of the 2.5 litre to 2999cc class, and that allows a minimum weight of just 960 kilos. Unlike the typical iron block Audi inline 5 engine, the Sport Quattro block is actually alloy and features cast iron liners for added strength. This page shows the original version runs Bosch LH Jetronic engine management with both a MAF sensor and a MAP sensor, as well as a 70mm throttle body. While cam duration didn't have to be specified for Group B, lift did, and this original version had 8.5mm lift on the inlet and 9mm lift on the exhaust. It featured 32mm inlet valves and 28mm exhaust valves. The two original homologated gearboxes are one relatively long ratio one and one that's super short. The homologated diff ratio for this car was 3.875 to 1, and we use 7,000 RPM as a conservative rev limit, and tyre size we'll say 245/50/16, presuming the car is running in tarmac spec. With the long ratio box, this would give 40 mph in first gear, 66 in second, 100 in third, 150 in fourth, and for a rally car, a massive 168 mph in fifth. Whether this box was actually ever used in rallying or purely for the homologation road car, I don't know. That's some seriously long gears for a rally car if it was ever used on stage. On the other hand, the second of the original homologated boxes is way more typical for a rally box. First gear is slightly longer to make it a little more usable, being 45 mph by 7,000 RPM in first, but from second onwards it's much shorter, 60 in second, 80 in third, 105 in fourth, and 122 in fifth, assuming a 7,000 RPM limiter and a tyre size roughly what I described. Also, as this page shows, the car was originally homologated with an open front diff and a switchable rear diff. Onto the bodywork, and this is something that surprises a lot of people, including me, but the original homologation form of the Sport Quattro, and that includes the road versions of course, had a lot less metal panels on it than most would imagine. The bonnet, tailgate, front wings, rear quarters and even the roof panel seems to be listed as plastics, which I presume is some kind of Kevlar fiberglass combination. Here's a couple of sneaky homologation add-ons too. First up, alternative suspension mounting points for the front top mounts, meaning they can switch things around while sticking to the rules. Secondly, and this is pure bullshit in the homologation team really in my eyes, but very clever, it was homologated with removable subframe spaces front and rear. That allows the subframe heights to be adjusted by over an inch by removing or refitting the various shims. They claim it is due to poor tolerances because of low production numbers, but I think it's far more likely this was used to run the subframe far closer to the body when the car was lowered for tarmac rallying. That enables the suspension arms to sit at a more optimal angle than they would otherwise on a lowered car. The manifolds are nice pieces of kit by the looks of it. Both look to flow well, and the inlet looks like a bit of a twin plenum design actually. And the exhaust manifold is cast iron but very well flowing design. Head ports are, with a difference of up to 2mm allowed, about 45 by 30mm on the inlet side and 38mm round exhaust ports. As a comparison, YB Cosworth ones, even when ported for over 600 brake on extreme engines, are generally far smaller on both sides, less than 30mm even on the most extreme ones, so these Audi ports are genuinely a good size for massive power. Now on to the bit I really geek out over, the turbo. This is a KKK K27 turbo, and the turbo wheel is 12 blade with a 76mm inducer and a 64mm exducer. As a comparison, that's a pretty big wheel, slightly bigger than even a Garrett GTX 3584 RS, and that's rated up to 1000 horsepower. This is a much older design compared to the Garrett I just mentioned, so it could never flow that well, but still, it's a big turbo wheel. The compressor wheel is pretty big also, with a 76mm exducer, but the inducer is only 48mm, so honestly, in this car's original spec, it was unlikely to be making more than about 400 braking miles. The turbo itself is a pretty typical looking non-wastegated K27, with the usual Audi turbine inlet flange, which is similar to a T3 flange but not quite, and a normal 4-bore out. Lastly, for the original spec homologation car, let's have a quick look at the roll cage. It was a pretty basic affair by today's standards, and also wildly unlike today's items, it was made from, and fully within the rules to do this as well, an aluminium zinc magnesium alloy mix. It was light for sure because of that, 25 kilograms including all the fixings, as yes, it was mostly bolted in, but strong, well, it wouldn't be classed as legal these days.
The reigning king of the hill is in fact a French woman, Michelle Mouton, who last year raced her all-wheel drive Audi Quattro to a new Pikes Peak record, an achievement that didn't go unnoticed by Bobby Unser.
When Michelle Mouton came up last year, 1985, I looked at the car and I watched her run. Very steep, always gaining in altitude, and so it strains the engine. The engine is always lugging and always bogging down hard. And the third thing is it's on ground up granite rock. Very, very, very much ahead of anything that I'd ever seen before. Astounded me.
The record that was set in '85, most of the people around here thought, well, that's about it. It's as fast as anybody's going to go.
So that was the basic homologation spec, but as mentioned, the upgrades were homologated thick and fast. First up, the oiling system was changed to dry sump. Not allowed in normal rallying, but this was Group B, so almost anything goes. A large race fuel cell was added. The original tank was 90 litres, which isn't shy in its own right, but this new one is pretty huge at 120 litres. Uprated drive shafts and redesigned wishbones, hubs, tie rods, and in fact almost the entire suspension setup, including a variety of thicknesses of anti-roll bars.
Dark horse in this championship battle was Malcolm Wilson, driving a Sport Quattro for the first time. Wilson responds, learning the short wheelbase Audi under difficult conditions. Friday morning, Malcolm Wilson is leading the Tudor Wabasto Manx Rally. It's a sensational drive.
The news just the day before the start of the death of Henry Toivonen in the Corsica Rally cast an air of gloom over this year's Welsh. Mikola had been close to Toivonen all his life and was deeply affected by the tragedy as he set off. The event began on the notorious Epid Ranges, high-speed stages with countless crests and blind brows that put the emphasis on local knowledge. Hannu Mikola was happy for a brief respite from the Epid tarmac as the rally tackled its first forest stage. Mikola's Audi, spitting flame as the 3 times winner of the Welsh International, responds to the challenge. And if you want proof of his commitment at this point. Just look at the object swinging from the driver's door. Mikola has taken the timekeeper's clock with him in his eagerness to fire off the start line.
For the brakes, an adjustable brake bias setup, hydraulic handbrake and line lock were all added. The line lock wasn't for burnouts or anything, it was purely to work to lock the car in place instead of the normal handbrake. The fuel injection setup was changed to a 10 injector design, 2 injectors per cylinder side by side, and the ECU was now a full MAP sensor setup with no MAF at all now, what they call Bosch Sport Injection. Looking at the engine, the crankshaft is now considerably lighter, 11 kilograms minimum now instead of the original 18.6, and the flywheel has dropped 2.5 kilograms too. The inlet ports are now 4mm wider than before, yet the exhaust ports are slightly smaller, probably to improve spool and response, as to be honest they were surprisingly big anyhow.
Mikola beat Llewellyn though on the very last stage, but it was clear that Britain had found a rally star of the future. The Welshman's first international win was duly delivered on the circuit of Ireland. Mikola had never won the circuit and wasn't going to win this time. On stage 1 he stopped with clutch problems. The repairs cost him 12 minutes and the mopping up was still going on when we caught up with him at the end of the stage.
Anu, what was the problem? It was the clutch cylinder got stuck and the clutch was down all the time. And I had to release complete clutch cylinder before we could go on, so that was the problem.
Problem solved now?
Yeah, problem is solved. It was just a small thing, but it took quite a long time to realize what was on.
Not a great start, but a long way to go.
Yeah.
But these spectator stages generally are very short.
For the two transmissions listed, the long ratio almost road box is now gone, and the original close ratio box is still there, but there's a new 6-speed box as well. Along with the new box, there's now 3 optional diff ratios listed: 4.857, 5.286 and 5.857. I'm not sure if these are in addition to the original 3.5 or instead of, but these are very short diffs for maximum acceleration, with only about 120 mile an hour even at like 8,000 RPM, and 6 with the longest 4.8, and barely over 100 mile an hour with the shortest 5.8. While there's always been rumours of huge top speeds in Group B cars, I honestly believe this 100-120 mile an hour estimated top speed from this is probably more accurate and roughly where the WRC cars are these days also. While the original homologation cars had a surprising amount of non-metal panels, this was stepped up straight away, with the doors and windows now made from forms of plastic. A larger rear spoiler was fitted, which had an integrated large oil cooler mounted as part of the spoiler, and unlike the famous Evolution versions of this car with wild bodywork additions, these first changes to the car included a much smaller front bumper for no ground clearance and pretty much no rear bumper. Weight savings on that would have been a minor bonus, but in reality it was mostly for clearance.
Mikola's victory was achieved on the sad weekend when we learnt of the death of Henry Toivonen on the Corsica Rally, the latest in a catalogue of tragic incidents this season. The sport's governing body was poised to change the regulations as a result, but after his Welsh victory, Mikola was optimistic those changes would preserve the power and spectacle of the sport.
When rallying has become so important like it is now, publicity and all the factories of course are trying to do their best, and when the factories are putting money and all the knowledge what they have got, it's just one way to go, and that's forward. And so you have to be very careful when you make the regulations, because normally people intend to go around those. So it has to be simple regulation how to reduce the speed.
Instead, FISA banned the powerful Group B cars from next season, a decision preempted by Audi withdrawing the works team with immediate effect. So on the Scottish no Mikola, and David Llewellyn was set to take over the championship lead. Away from the battle for the championship, there was John Buffum, America's top rally driver, in the full specification Audi Sport Quattro. The car being seen in the World Championship for the first time since Portugal. John Buffum in the Quattro was now slipping behind the pace set by the two flying Finns ahead of him. For the rest of the field, it was still the American John Buffum in third, putting on a good show for an admittedly sparse crowd who were getting their first glimpse of World Championship rallying. Buffum would finish in that third place, but a massive 20 minutes behind the two pace setters.
Unsurprisingly, one of the other first upgrades was the turbo. It's still a K27 and the turbo and wheel dimensions have remained unchanged, which is no surprise really as they were big anyhow. The compressor wheel, however, well now that really is truly very big. 87mm overall diameter and a 61mm inducer. In this day and age that would often be a turbo capable of well over 700 brake. And while the turbo design back then was nowhere near as efficient as today, there's without doubt that turbo is still capable of making upwards of 550 brake, possibly well over 600. The turbine housing is possibly unchanged, just like the turbine wheel is, but with no details barring pictures I can't confirm it, but it looks about the same. But as you would expect with a big compressor wheel, the compressor housing is noticeably larger than before, to the extent that many would call this turbo a K28 or K27, K29 hybrid, as that's a damn big compressor side for a K27. The next thing is interesting, and that's a water injection setup. If the picture on the homologation papers is accurate, it's very much like a conventional fuel injection system, with water being injected in a direct port style from a single rail and electronic injectors and controlled by its own ECU. What confuses me a little here is I don't recall ever seeing this visible in any Sport Quattro engine bay I've ever seen, so I'm guessing, providing this is all correct, that it's mounted underneath the inlet manifold so you can't see it. The next set of upgrades seem to have been homologated only a few months later and consisted of adjustable anti-roll bars, more suspension arm changes and an electronic water spray brake cooling setup. Finally, it's 1985 and there was 2 more diff ratios added, the longest of which, along with a higher rev limit these later cars were said to have, would allow a top speed of 130 mph or more. This may have been decided needed to keep up with the ever increasing speeds of the opposing cars. The original adjustable brake bias setup now became a nice in-car adjustable setup via a dash mounted knob, allowing changes mid-stage to cope with the various conditions. In April of 1985, some seriously beefy adjustable strut tops were added. It was July 1985 when the true E2 evolution of the Sport Quattro was homologated, the famous wild looking big wing monster, and the changes were massive. One thing worth noting though is not all the E2 cars seem to get all of these changes, especially when it comes to the Umluft anti-lag system and the PDK dual clutch gearbox. 2 more diff ratios are added, one longer again, which, along with 3 new gearbox setups, all with slightly longer gears than before, would mean the car could now potentially see over 150 mph at 8,000 RPM in top gear, and it's been said that these full spec cars rev design as 8,500 RPM on occasion. If you're wondering how Group B got to be considered too fast to race, well this might be a hint. As you now know, with this evolution, the bodywork was now really insane looking, but it was all for function rather than form, with a huge vented rear end there because the radiator was now rear mounted and was joined by two smaller additional coolers in the rear arches. The huge front spoiler and rear wing was now added too, as well as these very cool looking aero mirrors. Thanks to the bodywork changes, overall length and width was up by around 1 inch or so. Onto the aforementioned gearboxes. 3 of them are now in the homologation papers: a 5-speed H-pattern box, a 6-speed H-pattern box, and a 5-speed Porsche PDK sequential gearbox. What a PDK is a dual clutch gearbox, much like the DSG boxes of today that we all know, giving the car almost instant gear changes, and this car was one of the first cars ever to run this system decades before they become commonplace. Crankshaft weight was 700 grams lighter, now at 10.3 kilograms, and the flywheel has dropped another 1.5 kilogram down to just 3.5 kilograms. To note, the flywheel for the PDK box is only 1 kilogram. It's pretty much like an automatic car's flex plate. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it states the conrods are now 4mm longer than previously, which is often a preferred option for reliability on high RPM engines. One very unusual thing is what they've got listed as second generator in rear trunk with power drive and tuft belt for night drive. The accompanying picture shows an alternator with a tuft belt and pulley, no doubt charging the battery next to it, but what is the motor to the left of it that's providing the power? I don't know from the picture, but I do know of rallycross cars and similar that had a small moped engine mounted in the boot to power the alternator, so maybe this is very similar to that. Onto the engine, and the valve lift is now huge, 11.5mm on both the inlet and exhaust valves compared to just 8.5mm and 9mm on the original setup. The inlet and exhaust manifolds are totally redesigned, with the inlet now being a twin entry design but triple plenum, so it's got separate outer plenums, 2 of them, one on the top, one on the bottom, and then the main one in the middle. These twin plenum designs are there to equalise the airflow best they can, and for the first time as well, the exhaust manifold is no longer a cast item and is now a tubular manifold, probably made from Inconel or similar, and it features support braces added to take the weight of the turbo and the wastegates. The second, slightly smaller external wastegate you see in the pictures is actually the anti-lag valve, or Umluft, which is German for fresh air, as they called it. It works in the same manner as modern WRC anti-lag does, albeit decades earlier, by allowing air directly from the turbo compressor side to go into the runners of the exhaust manifold, which combined with unburnt fuel from a rich mixture and high exhaust temperatures creates combustion in the manifold and the turbine housing, which keeps the turbo spinning at high RPM even when the throttle is closed, much like how a gas turbine works basically. One thing I'm not really sure about is what's listed as a vacuum limiter and is mounted at the end of a relatively small bore pipe coming off the front of the inlet manifold. I've only seen one clear picture of it and it almost looks like a vent to atmosphere dump valve, but being a vacuum limiter it would work backwards to that, letting air in post throttle rather than venting air pre-throttle. Exactly why they're limiting vacuum in this way is not explained, but I'd suggest it's part of the anti-lag system, allowing air into the engine when the anti-lag is switched on and the throttle is closed, which in turn allows both more airflow through the engine, which in itself will help keep the turbo speed up, but would also prevent the car from bogging or stalling with heavily retarded ignition timing and large amount of fuel, two things that were probably added to improve the effectiveness of the anti-lag system.
The Audi engineers took on a new challenge, the World Rally Championship. By combining a radically new permanent all-wheel drive system and a turbocharged 5-cylinder engine, the Audi Quattro astonished the international rally community, winning on every conceivable type of road surface. With championships in 1982, 83, and 84, Audi developed technology that led to introducing a similar all-wheel drive system in its passenger cars. The roar of the world's fastest automobiles, competing in an event like none other in the world. A flat-out 12-mile sprint to the summit. The annual Race to the Clouds, the Pikes Peak Hill Climb. Behind the wheel of the Audi Quattro, Bobby Unser, at age 52, with a once-in-a-lifetime chance to regain his title, King of the Hill.
This is Jay Ritchie, live hill climb coverage on KVOR, and I'll tell you what, Bobby Unser Sr. came back to Pikes Peak with one thing in mind, not just to win, but to set a new Pikes Peak record. Bobby Unser is moving. Bobby Unser very near Glen Cove. Smooth, fast race as it appears from our vantage point. This could be a record-breaking run. You may be witnessing history. The time he needs to beat. The time turned in last year by Michel Mouton. We should be seeing Bobby Unser Jr. crossing the finish line any second now. Art Walsh holding the checkered flag. The helicopter's maneuvering overhead, one right above the finish line. He clears through the finish line. 11:09:22. The king of the mountain is back.
Just imagine that you can fantasize of anything that you ever want and then have it. And this is what I have in this car.
And that, my friends, is your lot from this episode, but providing you guys have liked what you've just watched, this is potentially number 1 in a massive series of these technical documentary type videos on countless race and rally cars. I'll start purely with the Group B cars, but I'll venture on to others too if there's demand for it. As ever, like, share, comment, subscribe, follow, do whatever you feel appropriate, as I'd love for these videos to get popular enough to make it worthwhile me making lots of them. Cheers then, ta-ra.